Greetings, students, and welcome to Monetary Policy in the Best Case Scenario. Okay? All right, so what do we have here? Well, we first got to set up ourselves a long run macroeconomic equilibrium here. All right, so we're going to have our inflation rate. Pi. And we're going to have our real growth. Growth rate of real GDP. And then we want to add our solo growth rate at 3% to represent the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay. Then we want to have the economy. Let's say it's at point A here. Okay. And that point A is associated with a spending growth level of 10%. All right, so what does that mean? Well, if we have a 3% real growth rate, the long run solo growth rate, then our inflation rate must have that add up to 10. So 7% inflation rate plus a 3% growth rate is our spending growth rate here. Okay. Now, this seems like a high inflation rate, but let's just say that this is what the economy is used to. And all of a sudden, it experiences a private decrease in spending. Okay. Now, one thing we want to add in before we get to that shock is we want to add in our third curve, which is our short-run aggregate supply curve. And so I'm going to make it curved to reflect our sticky wages. And our short-run aggregate supply is based on an expected inflation rate of 7%. Okay. All right, so you'll know you're in a long run equilibrium for the macroeconomy when the three curves intersect and the expected inflation matches the actual inflation rate. Okay. If expected inflation and actual inflation do not match, then you are in a business fluctuation. Okay. All right. All right, so now let's throw in the negative aggregate demand shock here. And so what we're going to have is a shock like so. Okay. And this new aggregate demand curve is associated with a spending growth rate of 5%. All right, and so where's our macroeconomy going to be? Is it going to be here or here? Well, it's going to be at the intersection of the aggregate demand curve, the new aggregate demand curve, and the short-run aggregate supply curve. We're going to call that point B. Okay. All right. So at point B, we have a 6% inflation rate. Okay. All right, and we had a 5% decrease in spending. So where does the other 4% go? Because 1% is a loss of the inflation rate. So the other 4% has to be taken off of the growth rate. Okay, and so 6 plus -1 is going to give us a 5% spending growth rate. So under this scenario, we have a negative aggregate demand shock. And that's going to cause a recession. Now, where is this negative aggregate demand shock coming from? Well, it's coming from a private decrease. So that negative aggregate demand shock, it's a private decrease. Okay. All right. So if we have a private decrease, the question is, what should we do? Well, what is decreasing? Well, M, the money supply growth rate, and the velocity growth rate are decreasing. Okay. Now, this, if it's a private decrease, it could be mostly coming from a shock to V. And if you recall back from chapter 13, the economy could self-correct there because changes in the velocity growth rate tend to be temporary. Okay. But also what might be going on this time is that from our knowledge from chapter 15 about the money multiplier is that maybe banks are a little nervous and they're not lending out as much of their deposits. Okay. So we could have a decrease in V and a decrease in M. Okay. Whatever the cause for this negative aggregate demand shock is, rather than waiting for it to reverse itself or for people to lower their inflation expectations, the Fed wants to quickly act and counteract it by a Fed increase in the money supply. Okay, so we're going to have a negative aggregate demand shock corrected by a Fed increase. What are they increasing? Well, they're increasing the monetary base. And hopefully that leads to an increase in M and an increase in V to get us back to where we're at here. Okay. So the best case scenario means that it's just a negative aggregate demand shock that the Fed can counteract. And so what's going to happen next? Well, even in the best case scenario, the Fed is working with information lags, imperfect data, and lags in the responsiveness of their policy. Okay, so remember the money multiplier is determined by the private commercial banks and financial intermediaries' willingness to loan out that increase in the monetary base the Fed has provided through perhaps its open market operations. Okay, all right, so it's quite possible that the Fed could overshoot or undershoot this correction here. Okay, and so what I'm saying here is that when we go over to figure 16.2, I'm going to draw in dashed lines what happens when even the best case scenario, we don't get what we call the Goldilocks scenario. So this scenario right here is just right. Okay. Now, if we undershoot, we're going to get something like this. All right, so I'm not going to draw it all the way because I've got writing down here. But imagine if we undershoot, what might happen? Okay. Well, if we undershoot, we're going to be at this intersection right here. And this would be at point C. Okay. And let's just say that is 6.3%. Okay. Okay. Now, if we drop this down here, maybe that gets us back to, say, 0.5%. So we're no longer in a recession, but we definitely have slow growth here. Wasn't quite enough to get us back to where we were. Okay, now what if the Fed overshoots? In that case, we can draw this overshoot here. So I'm going to do this out here. Okay, And if the Fed overshoots, well, we're going to have too much money chasing too few goods, and this will be at point D, and maybe we'll just have, say, 4% growth rate, and say this money supply is, say, like 15% growth, okay, or let's just say 14% growth. So we could say we have an inflation rate of 10%, okay? So remember, Goldilocks is a fairy tale, and so the Fed, to have the knowledge of exactly how far to the left aggregate demand has shifted, and to be able to react in the right time to have the appropriate level of increase, is very rare. There's so many other ways in which it can undershoot and overshoot its monetary policy that chances are we're going to have weaker than targeted growth or higher than targeted inflation. Okay, and so even in the best case scenario, the Federal Reserve Bank's job at monetary policy is not easy to accomplish. In the next video, we're going to talk about how the Fed would react in the worst case scenario, which is when you have a real shock, a shift left of the aggregate demand curve. So, thank you.